What's a conspiracy that the US government does not want us to know? Story 1. The people have power. The conspiracy they need you to forget. The most effectively suppressed idea in American political life is not a secret program, a hidden document, or a classified operation. It is a concept so fundamental that it was written into the founding documents of the Republic, and so thoroughly obscured by 2 centuries of institutional drift that most Americans treat it as a polite fiction rather than an operative principle. The idea is that the people are the ultimate source of governmental authority, that the government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, the people have not merely the right but the duty to alter or abolish it. This is not a radical proposition. It is the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. The Continental Congress signed it. It became the foundational statement of American political philosophy. What happened to it subsequently is the conspiracy that requires no secret meetings to sustain. It maintains itself through the ordinary operation of a system designed to make the exercise of popular power as difficult, slow, and discouraging as possible. The mechanisms are not hidden. Voter registration requirements, gerrymandered districts, campaign finance systems that translate economic power directly into political power, media landscapes that define the boundaries of acceptable political discourse, educational systems that teach civics as history rather than as a living practice. None of these require coordination between conspirators. They are the accumulated product of decisions made by people who benefited from limiting popular power and who had the resources to institutionalize those limits. The most effective conspiracies are the ones that don't need to be kept secret because the people they affect have been persuaded that the alternative is impossible. The belief that the people have no real power is the most successfully implanted idea in American political culture. It is also, constitutionally and historically, false. Story 2. The Hollow Moon. What NASA actually found and why they went back 11 times the Apollo program, landed human beings on the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972, and deployed a range of scientific instruments including seismometers designed to measure lunar seismic activity. The seismometers produced data that puzzled researchers for years. When the Apollo 12 crew deliberately crashed the ascent stage of their lunar module onto the moon's surface in November 1969, the seismometers recorded something unexpected. The moon rang like a bell, with seismic vibrations continuing for approximately 55 minutes. Subsequent deliberate impacts confirmed the phenomenon, with one producing vibrations that continued for over 3 hours. The scientific explanation for this behavior, which is real and documented in the NASA records, is that the moon's interior is significantly drier than the Earth's mantle, and that dry rock transmits seismic energy more efficiently than water-saturated rock, allowing vibrations to propagate for longer without damping. The moon's relatively cold interior also means fewer of the partially molten zones that absorb seismic energy in the Earth's mantle. The ringing is explained by composition, not by a hollow interior. The hollow moon hypothesis predates the Apollo seismic data and was proposed by Soviet researchers Isaac Asimov and others in different forms across several decades. In its most dramatic version, the moon is an artificial object, a constructed habitat or vehicle, placed in Earth orbit by an intelligence that has not been identified. The precise orbital characteristics of the moon, which are unusual in the solar system, its size relative to Earth, its perfectly circular orbit, the fact that it presents exactly one face to Earth, are cited as evidence of deliberate engineering. The NASA hiding the hollow moon theory requires that the publicly available seismic data has been altered, that thousands of scientists across decades of lunar research have maintained a coordinated silence, and that the hollow moon explanation is more parsimonious than the well-supported geological one. Each of these requirements is difficult to sustain. The bell-ringing moon is real. The explanation for it is not a conspiracy. Story 3. Flight 93. The hero's narrative and what the military had time to do. United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, on the morning of September 11, 2001, at 10:03 a.m. The official account that passengers, informed by cell phone calls about the earlier hijackings, organized a revolt against the hijackers and attempted to retake the cockpit, causing the plane to crash before reaching its intended target, is supported by the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, and the calls made by passengers to family members in the final minutes of the flight. The official account is emotionally powerful, politically useful, and supported by substantial physical evidence. The alternative hypothesis that Flight 93 was shot down by a U.S. Air Force fighter jet is supported by a different body of evidence that the official account does not fully absorb. Multiple witnesses in the Shanksville area reported seeing a second aircraft in the vicinity of Flight 93 in the moments before the crash. Some witnesses reported hearing what sounded like an explosion before the impact. The debris field was distributed over a surprisingly large area for a crash produced by ground impact rather than an airborne disintegration. The flight data recorder ended 8 minutes before the reported crash time, a discrepancy that has not been conclusively explained. The context matters. By 10:03 a.m., the World Trade Center towers had been struck and the Pentagon had been hit. NORAD had been alerted, and fighters had been scrambled. The political and military leadership of the United States was aware that aircraft were being used as weapons. The decision to authorize the shooting down of a civilian aircraft, a decision that would have been agonizing and that the military was prepared to make, would have been far easier to allow to be reframed as passenger heroism than to acknowledge publicly. The hero's narrative requires no one to admit to ordering the death of 44 Americans. It is a better story in every political dimension. Story 4. Pluto's demotion, the planet they quietly stopped talking about. In 2006, the International Astronomical Union voted to reclassify Pluto from the 9th planet of the solar system to a dwarf planet, one of many trans-Neptunian objects in the outer solar system, distinguished from the classical planets by its failure to clear the neighborhood around its orbit of other celestial bodies. The decision was scientifically motivated. The discovery of Eris, a trans-Neptunian object approximately the same size as Pluto, raised the question of whether the solar system had 9 planets or dozens, and the EAO's reclassification resolved the definitional problem by creating a new category. The public reaction to Pluto's demotion was disproportionate by any measure of rational response to an astronomical classification decision. People were upset. Children wrote letters. Bumper stickers appeared. The emotional attachment to Pluto, discovered in 1930 by American astronomer Clyde Tombaugh, the only planet found by an American, the planet that had been in the textbooks of everyone alive at the time of its reclassification, proved more durable than most scientific reclassifications. The resource harvesting hypothesis is, on its face, not more implausible than the hollow moon theory or several other propositions that circulate in this space. Pluto, at 9 billion kilometers from Earth at its closest approach, is not accessible to any current or near-future human technology. The New Horizons spacecraft, launched in 2006, the same year as the reclassification, took 9 years to reach Pluto and conducted a flyby rather than an orbital insertion or landing. The images it returned showed a geologically active world with nitrogen ice plains, methane-capped mountains, and a complex atmospheric haze. Whatever resources Pluto may contain are orders of magnitude beyond any current or projected human harvesting capability. The demotion was a classification decision. The classification decision was scientifically motivated. The conspiracy requires ignoring both of these facts. Story 5. Nobody is in control. The most terrifying government conspiracy of all, the most unsettling conspiracy theory about the United States government is not that it is secretly competent and malevolent, running programs of mass surveillance, resource extraction, population control, and global manipulation from a position of perfect information and coordinated intent. That version of the conspiracy, though disturbing, has a certain comfort to it. It implies that someone is in charge, that the chaos of the world is managed rather than genuine, that there is a plan even if the plan is bad. The genuinely terrifying proposition is the opposite, that no one is in control, that the systems of government, finance, and military power that shape billions of lives are operated by people who are making decisions in real time with inadequate information, competing institutional interests, and no coherent long-term strategy, and that the appearance of coordinated intent is itself a kind of myth that both the powerful and the powerless need to believe for different reasons. The historical record supports this reading more than the competent conspiracy reading does. Intelligence failures are the norm rather than the exception. Pearl Harbor, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Bay of Pigs, September 11, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID pandemic response. Each of these represents a catastrophic failure of the systems that were supposedly designed to prevent exactly what occurred. The people running these systems were not deliberately engineering bad outcomes. They were failing at their stated objectives while maintaining the institutional posture of competence. The conspiracy of incompetence is scarier than the conspiracy of malevolence because it offers no adversary to identify, expose, or defeat. It is not a conspiracy in the conventional sense. It is a system property, the emergent behavior of large organizations staffed by fallible humans operating with incomplete information under political constraints that reward the appearance of competence over its substance. The government does not want you to know it has no idea what it is doing. The government also, largely, has no idea what it is doing. Story 6. Economic Hitman. How private consulting firms overthrow countries without firing a shot. John Perkins published Confessions of an Economic Hitman in 2004, describing his work as a consultant for an international economic consulting firm in the 1970s. His account describes a systematic process by which large loans were arranged for developing countries. Loans nominally intended to fund infrastructure development, but structured in ways that made default likely. When default occurred, the lender, typically the World Bank or the IMF, backed by U.S. interests, was in a position to demand concessions, access to natural resources, military basing rights, political alignment with U.S. foreign policy objectives. The process was, in Perkins's account, deliberate. The consultants who designed the economic projections used to justify the loans knew the projections were inflated, and that the borrowing countries could not repay. The pattern Perkins describes, known in critical economics as debt trap diplomacy, is visible in the historical record of U.S. relationships with developing countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Countries that received large infrastructure loans in the post-war period frequently found themselves in debt crises that required IMF restructuring programs imposing austerity conditions that reduced public services, opened natural resource extraction to foreign corporations, and constrained the policy options of democratically elected governments. The mechanism does not require a secret conspiracy in the traditional sense. It operates through the ordinary incentives of international finance, where the terms of lending are set by institutions dominated by the world's largest economies, and where the political conditions attached to loans reflect the interests of those same economies. The IMF's structural adjustment programs are public documents. The terms of major infrastructure loans are public record. The outcomes in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in multiple African nations are historically documented. Whether this constitutes a deliberate strategy of economic imperialism or an emergent property of international finance dominated by wealthy nations is the question that the available evidence does not definitively resolve. The pattern is real. The intent is debated. The outcome for the countries involved is not. Story 7. DNA databases and ancestry tests. What you gave away for a pie chart. The direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry, companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and several competitors, has collectively collected the genetic information of over 30 million Americans as of the mid-2020s. Customers submit a saliva sample, pay a fee typically between $100 and $200, and receive reports on their ancestry composition, health predispositions, and connections to genetic relatives. The value proposition, knowing where your ancestors came from and identifying distant relatives, has proven commercially compelling enough to build several large companies. The privacy implications of this voluntary mass genetic database have been documented rather than speculated. Law enforcement agencies have used genetic genealogy databases, initially without explicit customer consent, to identify criminal suspects through the DNA of relatives who have submitted their genetic information to consumer databases. The Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 using this technique, matching crime scene DNA against a public genealogy database and then identifying the suspect through the family relationships revealed. The technique has since been used in hundreds of criminal cases. GEDmatch, one of the databases used, subsequently changed its terms of service to require users to opt into law enforcement matching rather than opt out. The CIA connection is the claim that extends the documented reality into less evidenced territory. The documented reality is that the U.S. government has multiple legal mechanisms for accessing private databases, national security letters, court orders, and the voluntary cooperation of companies under classified data sharing agreements. Whether the CIA specifically has an arrangement with consumer genetics companies has not been publicly confirmed. Whether the intelligence value of a database containing the genetic information of tens of millions of Americans, including their health predispositions, their family relationships, and their geographical heritage, would be significant to intelligence agencies is not a difficult question to answer. The pie chart showing your 23% Irish ancestry is real. What happens to the raw data that produced it is less transparent. Story 8. Area 51 doesn't have aliens. It has things that are almost more interesting. Area 51. The classified U.S. Air Force installation in the Nevada desert, formerly known as the Nevada Test and Training Range, has been the center of UFO mythology for decades. The secrecy surrounding the facility, the restricted airspace and ground access, the occasional anomalous aerial sightings by civilians in the surrounding area, and the government's long-standing refusal to officially acknowledge the base's existence combine to create a cultural narrative of alien aircraft and recovered extraterrestrial technology that has proven extraordinarily durable. The CIA declassified documents in 2013 that confirmed the facility's existence and its actual function. The testing and development of classified reconnaissance aircraft, the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the A-12 Oxcart, all aircraft whose performance characteristics so far exceeded publicly acknowledged aviation technology at the time of their development that sightings of them by civilian pilots and observers generated UFO reports that were deliberately not corrected by the Air Force. Allowing the public to believe in alien aircraft was preferable to revealing the capabilities of classified reconnaissance platforms. The genuine secret was protected by the alien story. The current programs at the facility, which continue under classification, are the subject of ongoing speculation. The documented history of what Area 51 has produced suggests that whatever is currently being tested there is, by definition, beyond publicly acknowledged aviation and weapons technology. The B-2 stealth bomber was a classified program for years before it was revealed. The F-117 stealth fighter was operated in secret for a decade. The facility's history is a record of technologies that seemed impossible until they were acknowledged. The aliens in Area 51 narrative is not true. The narrative that there is nothing interesting at Area 51 is also not true. What is there is classified human technology, which is, for the purposes of national security, considerably more useful to keep secret than aliens. Story 9, the Stargate program, the remote viewing project that actually happened. Project Stargate was a real United States government program. This is not contested. It was funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA from the early 1970s through 1995, cost approximately $20 million and investigated the potential military applications of psychic phenomena, specifically remote viewing, the claimed ability to perceive information about distant locations or events without physical access or conventional sensory information. The program was conducted with a level of scientific rigor that surprised many subsequent reviewers. The Stanford Research Institute researchers who developed the protocols, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, were credentialed physicists. The experimental design used double-blind procedures and statistical analysis. The remote viewers were tested against controls. The results were reviewed by the American Institutes for Research in 1995 at the CIA's request, and the review concluded that the statistical results exceeded chance expectations, that something was happening in the experiments that the conventional explanation of random variation did not fully account for. The 1995 review also concluded that the program had not produced actionable intelligence of demonstrated operational value, and the CIA terminated the program. The termination decision and the declassification of the program's existence were presented publicly as a decision to end an ineffective program. Whether the declassification represented a genuine program ending or a public retirement of a program that continued under different classification is the question that the available record does not answer. The documented history of the Stargate program is remarkable precisely because it reveals that the U.S. government took the possibility of psychic intelligence seriously enough to fund research for 2 decades. The results they found were inconclusive enough to terminate the program officially. What they considered inconclusive enough to keep is a different question from what they considered inconclusive enough to publish. Story 10. The Bilderberg Group. The annual meeting that isn't supposed to be interesting. The Bilderberg meeting is an annual conference of approximately 120 to 150 people representing governments, finance, industry, academia, and media from North America and Europe. It has been held since 1954. Its founding purpose was to improve transatlantic relations during the Cold War. Its current stated purpose is to foster dialogue between Europe and North America. Attendees in recent years have included heads of government, central bank chairs, major financial institution CEOs, technology company executives, and senior intelligence and defense officials. The meeting agenda is published in advance. Attendees are publicly listed. No press is admitted, no minutes are taken, and participants are not expected to report on what was discussed. The conspiracy theories surrounding Bilderberg range from the plausible to the Baroque. The plausible version notes that a meeting of 150 of the most powerful people in Western finance, government, and media, conducted without any formal record or public accountability, represents an unusual concentration of coordinated influence outside democratic oversight mechanisms. When the chairman of a major central bank, the head of a major investment bank, and the prime minister of a G7 country are in the same room for 3 days with no external oversight and an agreement not to discuss what was said, the opportunity for coordination on matters of mutual, financial, and political interest exists regardless of whether such coordination occurs. The Baroque version adds a shadow government running the world from these annual meetings, determining election outcomes, controlling media narratives, and managing the global economy according to a coordinated long-term agenda. This version requires more evidence than the plausible version and has less. What is documented is the meeting, the attendees, and the absence of records. What is speculated is everything that follows from that absence. The meeting happens, the records don't exist, the attendees are very powerful, the rest is inference. Story 11. NASA's Homesick Aliens, the conspiracy that is its own punchline. The proposition that NASA is staffed by extraterrestrial beings attempting to find their way home is not intended seriously by anyone who proposes it, but it has a structural logic that is worth examining briefly before dismissing. The argument runs as follows. Humans, left to their own evolutionary trajectory and resource limitations, would not have developed the motivation to explore space on the schedule actually observed. The extraordinary expenditure of national resources on the Apollo program, occurring in a Cold War context that provided external motivation but not internal evolutionary logic, suggests that some external factor accelerated the human interest in space beyond what would be expected. The external factor could be many things. A genuine belief that other civilizations exist and that space is the place to find them. A belief held with unusual intensity by many of the scientists and engineers who drove the space program. A military rationale for space-based surveillance and weapons capability. A straightforward nationalistic competition with the Soviet Union that happened to express itself in a domain whose long-term implications no one fully understood at the time. Or, in the version being considered here, the participation of beings who were motivated by reasons that were not purely human. The actual history of NASA includes genuinely unusual biographical details about some of its founders. Most prominently, Jack Parsons, the rocket fuel pioneer, who was also a practicing occultist with documented connections to Aleister Crowley's Thelema movement, and who believed he was participating in magical work of cosmic significance. The presence of committed mystics, science fiction readers who took interstellar travel seriously as a near-term project, and rocket scientists who wrote science fiction alongside their engineering work, created an institutional culture at NASA's origins that was, by ordinary bureaucratic standards, unusually visionary in its ambitions. None of this makes them aliens. It does make them interesting. Story 12. Slow Poisoning of America. The documented history of government chemical testing the proposition that the American population has been subjected to deliberate chemical, biological, and radiological exposure by its own government is not a conspiracy theory in the conventional sense. It is documented history. The question is not whether it happened, but what the purpose was and whether it is ongoing. The documented cases are numerous and extend across decades. Between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. Army conducted open-air biological warfare tests over populated areas of the United States, including San Francisco, Minneapolis, New York City, and St. Louis. In the San Francisco tests, the Navy sprayed Serratia marcescens, then believed to be a harmless simulant for biological warfare agents, over the city. One man died of a Serratia infection in the days following the test. In St. Louis, zinc-cadmium sulfide particles were sprayed from motorized blowers in low-income residential neighborhoods in what Army documents describe as tests of dispersal patterns. Residents were not informed. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, enrolled 399 black men with syphilis and withheld treatment from them, including penicillin after it became the standard of care in the 1940s, in order to observe the natural progression of the disease. The study continued for 40 years and was ended only when a whistleblower leaked the details to the press. Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, conducted dozens of tests of biological and chemical agents on U.S. military personnel from the 1960s through the 1970s. Many test participants were not informed of the nature of the agents to which they were exposed. The conspiracy is not speculative. The dumbed-down populist thesis that the cumulative effect of environmental chemical exposure has had neurological consequences at the population level extends beyond documented events into territory where causation is harder to establish. The documented events are sufficient to establish that the government has, repeatedly and with intent, exposed its population to harmful substances without consent. Story 13. The cancer cure the industry cannot afford to find. The cancer industry in the United States generates approximately $200 billion in annual revenue from treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, imaging, pharmaceuticals, hospital care, and the associated support industries. The business model of oncology, like the business model of most medical specialties, is structured around the management of disease rather than its elimination. A patient who is cured generates revenue once. A patient who is managed, whose cancer is controlled, whose remissions and recurrences require ongoing monitoring and treatment, generates revenue across years or decades. This is not a secret. It is the stated structure of a for-profit healthcare industry whose investors require return on investment. The incentive structure does not require anyone to deliberately suppress a cancer cure. It simply creates a system in which research programs that produce patentable, regulatable, long-term management therapies receive more commercial development than research programs that might produce a one-time curative intervention. The financial bias against cure is structural rather than conspiratorial. The specific claim that the government or the pharmaceutical industry possesses a cure for cancer that it is deliberately withholding runs into a significant obstacle. Cancer is not one disease. It is a category of approximately 200 distinct diseases characterized by the uncontrolled growth of abnormal cells, whose causes, mechanisms, and responses to treatment vary enormously across tissue types and genetic contexts. A cure for one type of cancer is not a cure for another. The identification of a single universal cancer cure would require solving problems that are, at the molecular level, distinct for each cancer type. What does exist, and what receives less research funding than the commercial incentive structure would optimize for, are immunotherapy approaches, cancer vaccines, and other interventions that show genuine curative potential for specific cancers. The suppression of these is not absolute. It is economical. The cure for some cancers exists or is close. The infrastructure for developing and delivering it efficiently is shaped by incentives that favor management over cure. Story 14. The government is barely functioning. The conspiracy nobody wants to believe, the version of government conspiracy that requires the least evidence and the most imagination, is not the hidden alien technology or the secret world government. It is the proposition that the institutions of the United States federal government are, at the operational level, significantly less competent and coordinated than they present to the public, and that the gap between the institutional posture of competence and the actual capability of the organization is itself a kind of ongoing deception. The evidence for this reading is available in public documents, congressional testimony, inspector general reports, and the plain record of governmental failures across multiple domains. The intelligence community failed to predict the September 11 attacks, despite possessing information that, in retrospect, was sufficient to prevent them. The response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 revealed an emergency management system that, under actual emergency conditions, was unable to perform the functions it was designed and funded to perform. The 2008 financial crisis was not predicted by the regulatory agencies whose mandate included detecting systemic risk. The COVID-19 response revealed supply chain fragilities in medical equipment and personal protective equipment that had been identified in previous pandemic planning exercises and not corrected. None of these failures require malice. They require the normal dynamics of large bureaucratic organizations, institutional inertia, siloed information, incentive structures that reward the appearance of function over its substance, and the difficulty of maintaining operational readiness for low-probability, high-consequence events. The conspiracy is not that the government is secretly evil. The conspiracy is that it presents itself as competent when the record of its performance suggests it is operating at the margins of functional adequacy across most of its domains. This is the conspiracy that the government most actively maintains, because the alternative, acknowledged institutional failure would undermine the legitimacy on which its authority depends. The performance of competence is a survival strategy. The reality beneath the performance is what it is. Story 15. Millard Fillmore in a Tank. America's most niche government secret. Millard Fillmore was the 13th President of the United States, serving from 1850 to 1853 following the death of Zachary Taylor. He is consistently ranked by historians as one of the least consequential presidents in American history, best known for his failure to address the slavery question and for signing the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, legislation that required citizens of free states to participate in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. He died on March 8, 1874, in Buffalo, New York. He is buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo. His death was recorded, his burial was witnessed, and the historical record of his final years is reasonably well documented. The proposition that Millard Fillmore is being kept alive in a tank beneath the White House is, on its face, the least plausible item in this entire collection. It requires that the 13th President of the United States, who died at the age of 74 in 1874, has been maintained in a state of suspended animation or ongoing biological support for approximately 150 years in a classified facility beneath the most heavily documented building in the United States. It requires that every subsequent administration, 37 of them at the time of writing, has been briefed on and maintained this secret. It requires a purpose that no one has satisfactorily articulated, and yet there is something philosophically interesting about including it in a list of things the government does not want you to know. Every other item on this list is there because it is plausible enough to discuss seriously. This one is there because it is implausible enough to be funny. The question it raises is where the line falls between the plausible conspiracy and the absurd one, and whether that line is as clear as we assume. The government is definitely not keeping Millard Fillmore alive in a tank. The certainty with which we can say this should make us slightly more curious about the things we cannot say it about. Story 16. Venezuela's economic collapse. The invisible hand that pushed it. Venezuela's economic collapse, from the wealthiest country in South America by per capita income in the early 2000s, to a nation experiencing hyperinflation, mass emigration, food insecurity, and infrastructure collapse by the late 2010s, has official explanations that are partially true and a fuller account that implicates external actors the official explanation prefers not to emphasize. The official explanation attributes Venezuela's collapse to the mismanagement of the Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro governments, the nationalization of the oil industry that reduced production efficiency, the price controls and currency manipulation that distorted markets, the political corruption that diverted resources, and the dependence on oil revenues that left the economy vulnerable to the 2014 oil price decline. These factors are real and significant. The fuller account includes the deliberate application of economic pressure by the United States government. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela that restricted access to financial markets, limited the ability of the state oil company to obtain financing, and complicated transactions with international partners. The stated purpose of the sanctions was to pressure the Maduro government on human rights and democratic governance. The practical effect was to accelerate the economic deterioration that the Maduro government's own policies had already initiated. The distinction between sanctions that respond to economic collapse and sanctions that cause economic collapse is one that the U.S. government has a strong interest in drawing in its preferred direction. Congressional testimony and State Department communications from the relevant period document an explicit U.S. strategy of maximizing economic pressure on Venezuela as a mechanism of political destabilization, of using economic suffering as a lever of regime change. Whether the human cost of that strategy, the Venezuelans who died, fled, or experienced extreme deprivation, was an acceptable price for the political objective, is a question that U.S. policy documents generally do not address directly. The strategy was deliberate. The consequences were predictable. The attribution of those consequences exclusively to the Maduro government is incomplete. Story 17. HAARP and Weather Control, what the program actually does. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP, is a research facility in Gacona, Alaska, originally funded by the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and DARPA. and subsequently transferred to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Its primary instrument is a high-power radio frequency transmitter capable of temporarily exciting a limited region of the ionosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere, for research purposes. The facility has been used to study ionospheric physics, radio propagation, and the effects of radio frequency energy on the upper atmosphere. It is a real facility conducting real research, and its capabilities and operations are documented in scientific literature. The weather control theory attributes to HAARP a capability, the ability to create, direct, or intensify tornadoes, hurricanes, and other severe weather events, that is not supported by the physics of how the facility operates. The ionosphere sits at altitudes of 60 to 1,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Atmospheric weather systems operate in the troposphere, which extends from the surface to approximately 12 kilometers altitude. The energy levels that HAARP can inject into the ionosphere, while significant by research standards, are orders of magnitude smaller than the energy involved in the development and maintenance of severe weather systems. The causal pathway from ionospheric heating to surface weather is not established in the scientific literature. The broader category of weather modification technology is real and less exotic than HAARP. Cloud seeding, the introduction of particles into clouds to stimulate precipitation, has been practiced since the 1940s and is routinely used in water management programs in multiple countries. China's cloud seeding program is the largest in the world. The U.S. military has a documented history of weather modification research, including Operation Popeye during the Vietnam War, which used cloud seeding to extend the monsoon season over supply routes. The ability to create a tornado on command does not exist. The ability to influence precipitation does. Story 18. Pearl Harbor, the warning that was there, and the attack that wasn't stopped. The question of what the Roosevelt administration knew before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, has been the subject of historical investigation, congressional inquiry, and sustained conspiracy theorizing for more than 80 years. The documented record is complex enough to sustain multiple interpretations. What is documented, U.S. military intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic and naval codes and was reading significant volumes of Japanese communications in the months before Pearl Harbor. The communications included references to a surprise attack on a specific date and location that some analysts have argued, in retrospect, pointed clearly to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, the commanders in Hawaii, were court-martialed for failures of readiness and warned of potential attack, but not provided with specific intelligence about Pearl Harbor as the target. Multiple inquiries, the Roberts Commission, the Hart Inquiry, the Army Pearl Harbor Board, the Navy Court of Inquiry, the Clausen Investigation, the Hewitt Inquiry, and the Joint Congressional Committee reached different conclusions about where responsibility for the intelligence failure lay. The conspiracy version, that Roosevelt knew the attack was coming, withheld the intelligence from Kimmel and Short, and allowed the attack to proceed in order to generate the public outrage necessary to bring the United States into the war, requires evidence of deliberate suppression rather than intelligence failure. The intelligence picture available to Washington before December 7 was genuinely ambiguous. Japan was considered likely to attack, but the likely targets included Malaya, the Philippines, and other Pacific locations in addition to Hawaii. Whether the failure to prevent Pearl Harbor was incompetence, coordination failure, analytical error, or deliberate non-prevention is a question the available documents support different answers to. The political utility of a Japanese attack was understood in Washington. Whether that understanding became operational policy is the question that remains unresolved. Story 19. U.S. foreign policy is war profiteering. The conspiracy that is just economics. Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address in January 1961 contains the most important warning in American political history that no one acted on. The outgoing president, a five-star general who had commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II and spent 8 years in the White House, warned the American people about the influence of what he called the military-industrial complex, the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry whose combined influence was felt in every city, every state house, and every office of the federal government. He said explicitly that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power existed and would persist. The subsequent history of American foreign policy is largely a demonstration that Eisenhower's warning was accurate. The major military interventions of the post-Cold War period, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Libya intervention, the Syria engagement, each created or sustained demand for the products and services of defense contractors whose executives sit on the boards of think tanks that advocate for military solutions, whose lobbyists fund the political campaigns of legislators who authorize military budgets, and whose revolving door with the Department of Defense ensures that the people making procurement decisions and the people receiving procurement contracts are drawn from the same professional network. The domestic version of the same dynamic is the legislative process, through which the distribution of congressional districts ensures that major defense contracts are distributed across enough states to make the cancellation of any specific program politically costly, regardless of its military merit. The F-35 program, whose costs have exceeded $1 trillion and whose performance has been criticized by military pilots and defense analysts, has components manufactured in 45 states. Canceling it is politically impossible for exactly this reason. The policy serves the industry. The industry funds politics. Politics produces policy. No secret meetings required. Story 20. Military technology is decades ahead. The gap nobody talks about. The history of U.S. military technology development contains a documented pattern in which capabilities that are publicly acknowledged represent a significant lag behind what is actually operational. The F-117 stealth fighter was first flown in 1977, operated in secret for approximately a decade, and was not publicly acknowledged until 1988. The SR-71 Blackbird, which flew at speeds exceeding Mach 3.2 and altitudes exceeding 85,000 feet, was developed in a classified program in the early 1960s, decades ahead of what civilian aviation technology suggested was achievable. The principle is straightforward. Defense research and development is funded at levels that consistently exceed civilian research budgets for comparable technologies, operates under classification that protects developments from commercial competition and foreign intelligence, and is motivated by strategic imperatives that drive it toward performance frontiers regardless of cost. The result is a consistent gap between publicly known capability and actual operational capability. The current estimate of a 10-year technology gap between military and consumer grade is conservative by historical standards. The gap in computing has been documented. The NSA's cryptographic computing capability has consistently been estimated by security researchers to be significantly ahead of the commercial sector. The gap in materials science, propulsion, directed energy weapons, and autonomous systems is suggested by occasional public glimpses, the declassified details of programs that have already been superseded internally. The Aurora program, a hypothetical classified successor to the SR-71, has been speculated about since the late 1980s based on unusual radar and acoustic signatures observed by civilians near Area 51. Whether Aurora or a similar program exists has never been confirmed. The pattern of classified hypersonic aircraft development, which has now been partially acknowledged through the X-51 and other publicly known programs, suggests that classified hypersonic capability beyond what is publicly acknowledged would follow the historical pattern. The government does not announce what it can do until it needs to. What it needs to keep secret defines the gap. Story 21. Depopulation. The policy nobody calls by its name. The proposition that powerful individuals and institutions have sought to reduce the global human population is not, in its most moderate form, a conspiracy theory. It is a documented intellectual and policy position with a history extending from the Malthusian anxieties of the 19th century through the eugenics movements of the early 20th century to the population control, programs funded by major foundations and implemented through international development policy across the latter half of the 20th century. The U.S. government's position on population growth is documented in National Security Study Memorandum 200, a classified 1974 document prepared by Henry Kissinger's National Security Council and declassified in 1989. NSSM 200 argued that rapid population growth in developing countries was a threat to U.S. strategic interests, and recommended that population reduction in those countries be incorporated into U.S. foreign policy. The mechanisms proposed included increasing access to contraception, integrating family planning into development assistance, and using U.S. influence through the World Bank and other international institutions to promote population reduction as a condition of economic development assistance. The document was adopted as official U.S. policy and remained classified for 15 years. The conspiracy version extends this documented policy into claims of deliberate mass sterilization, contaminated vaccines, and engineered diseases targeted at specific populations. These claims vary considerably in their evidential support. The documented history of coercive sterilization programs in the United States targeting poor, minority, and disabled women well into the 1970s, of population control programs in developing countries that applied pressure and financial incentives in ways that fell short of consent, of the explicit connection between development assistance and population reduction, is sufficient to establish that coercive population management has occurred within living memory by governments that denied doing it while doing it. The line between documented policy and conspiracy theory in this domain is thinner than the conspiracy theorists and their critics both prefer. Story 22. The world's richest woman nobody has heard of. Power Without a Face. The Forbes list of the world's wealthiest individuals is a useful index of publicly acknowledged, legally structured, reportable wealth. It captures the assets of people whose financial position is documented in corporate filings, public records, and the disclosure requirements of publicly traded companies. It does not capture wealth held through structures designed to avoid disclosure, through private foundations, through non-public entities in jurisdictions with minimal reporting requirements, through beneficial ownership structures that place legal ownership in the hands of nominees, while the beneficial owner retains control. The proposition that the world's wealthiest individual is someone whose name does not appear on the Forbes list is structurally plausible given what is known about the mechanisms of wealth concealment available to the very rich. Estimates of the total value of assets held in offshore financial centers, based on analysis of balance of payments discrepancies, Swiss banking data, and corporate ownership registries, suggest that the wealth held outside the formal financial reporting system is substantial. Studies by economists including Gabriel Zucman have estimated that approximately 10% of global GDP is held in offshore financial centers by a relatively small number of beneficial owners. The specific claim about an Italian woman who is the current head of the mafia, whose accounts receive 1% of global financial flows, and who receives quarterly visits from the Pope, is, as stated, unverified and implausible in its specific details. The claim about mafia leadership in particular is internally contradictory with the claim about concealed wealth, since organized crime leadership of this scale would itself generate significant intelligence attention. But the underlying phenomenon, extreme wealth held by individuals whose identity is deliberately obscured from public view, is real, documented, and significantly underreported in the mainstream conversation about inequality and power. The richest person in the world probably isn't on the list. Their name is the point. Story 23. Media control and the chilling effect. How consent is manufactured. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, proposed a model for understanding the output of mass media that does not require individual journalists to be corrupt, compromised, or deliberately deceptive. The propaganda model identifies 5 filters through which news content passes before it reaches the public: ownership, advertising dependence, source relationships, flack, and ideological framing. each of which systematically shapes what is covered, how it is covered, and what is excluded, without requiring explicit coordination between the people operating the system. The ownership filter observes that media companies are large corporations whose owners have financial interests across multiple industries. The news content they produce does not typically threaten those interests, not because of explicit editorial direction, but because the hiring, promotion, and culture of large media organizations selects for journalists and editors who share the values and assumptions of the institutional environment they work in. The advertising filter observes that media companies are funded by advertisers whose patronage depends on audience demographics and whose tolerance for content that threatens their interests or alienates their customers is limited. The resulting media landscape is one in which the range of covered political and economic perspectives is narrower than the range of perspectives that exist in the population, in which certain questions are structurally difficult to ask, and in which the assumptions embedded in the framing of news coverage reflect the interests of institutions that own and fund the media rather than the interests of the audience that consumes it. This is the conspiracy that is most extensively documented and least acknowledged in the mainstream conversation. It doesn't require secret meetings. It requires only the ordinary operation of corporate institutions responding to economic incentives. The psychic manacles of the media are real. They are invisible because they are everywhere. Story 24, Operation Mockingbird. The CIA's 400 journalists and the program that never ended. Operation Mockingbird is the name given to a CIA program of covert relationships with American journalists and media organizations that began in the early Cold War period. The program was investigated by the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, in 1975 and 1976. The committee's report acknowledged that the CIA maintained official, secret relationships with American journalists, though it declined to name the program or publish the identities of the journalists involved. Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post reporter who covered Watergate, published a detailed account in Rolling Stone in 1977 based on access to CIA files and interviews with current and former CIA employees. Bernstein's account identified approximately 400 American journalists who had worked for the CIA in various capacities, ranging from the provision of information to the active production of propaganda. The organizations identified included the major broadcast networks, major newspapers, wire services, and news magazines. The journalists involved were not all aware that they were participating in a CIA program. Some were simply providing information they considered patriotic sharing, while others were actively producing content under CIA direction. The documented record establishes that the program existed. The Church Committee's recommendation that the CIA should not use American journalists as agents has never been followed by legislation that would make such relationships illegal. The CIA has maintained in subsequent years that it does not run journalists, while declining to provide the detailed accounting that would verify this claim. The structural reality of Operation Mockingbird, that intelligence agencies have significant motivation to maintain relationships with journalists, that they have demonstrated willingness to do so, and that the classification systems that would conceal current relationships are fully intact, means that the program's end is assumed rather than verified. Story 25, The General Motors Streetcar Conspiracy, Convicted and Fined $1. In 1949, a federal jury in Chicago convicted General Motors, Standard Oil of California, Firestone Tire, Mack Trucks, and Phillips Petroleum of criminal conspiracy to monopolize interstate commerce in the sale of transportation equipment. The specific charge was that these companies had formed a holding company called National City Lines that purchased electric streetcar systems in cities across the United States, converted them to buses, and then destroyed the streetcar infrastructure. The jury found the companies guilty. The fine imposed on General Motors, the largest defendant, was $5,000. The fine imposed on the corporate officer personally convicted was $1. The factual record is not disputed. National City Lines did purchase and dismantle electric transit systems in multiple American cities. The transit mode of these cities did shift from electric rail to bus and, subsequently, private automobiles. The companies that sold buses, tires, and fuel to replace the electric systems profited from the transition. The infrastructure of electric rail, once removed, was not rebuilt. The contested question is whether the elimination of urban electric rail was primarily caused by the National City Lines conspiracy or primarily caused by other factors: the post-war preference for automobile travel, the suburbanization of American cities enabled by Federal Highway Act funding, the genuine economic challenges of operating rail systems in competition with subsidized automobile infrastructure. Urban historians have reached different conclusions, and the evidence supports the view that the conspiracy was one factor among several rather than the exclusive cause of the transition. The conviction stands. The fine was $1 for the company and $1 for the executive. The streetcars are gone. The relationship between those facts and the decisions that produced them is the history of American transportation policy. Story 26. Iraq's WMDs, the conspiracy that became conventional wisdom. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq on the stated justification that the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and potentially nuclear weapons that represented an unacceptable threat to American security and regional stability. The intelligence assessment supporting this justification was presented with high confidence by senior administration officials, including Secretary of State Colin Powell, in a presentation to the United Nations Security Council. Questioning whether the intelligence assessment was accurate was in the political climate of the time, framed as naive at best and unpatriotic at worst. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The comprehensive search conducted by the Iraq Survey Group, a 1,400-person team that spent more than a year examining Iraq's weapons programs after the invasion, concluded that Iraq had terminated its nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs in 1991 and had no active programs at the time of the 2003 invasion. The question of whether the administration knew the intelligence was flawed at the time of the invasion has been addressed through multiple subsequent investigations. The Senate Intelligence Committee concluded that the intelligence community's assessments were not supported by the underlying intelligence. The Downing Street Memo, a British intelligence document leaked to the press in 2005, records a senior British intelligence official stating in July 2002 that the intelligence and the facts were being fixed around the policy, that the decision to invade had been made, and the intelligence case was being constructed to justify it. The people who said in 2002 and 2003 that the WMD case was fabricated were called conspiracy theorists. They were correct. The people who made the fabricated case were not prosecuted. The country they invaded has not recovered. The conspiracy became conventional wisdom only after the damage was done. Story 27. COINTELPRO, the FBI's war on Black America. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, operated from 1956 to 1971 and targeted domestic political organizations that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover considered subversive. The program's targets included the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, white hate groups, and, most extensively and most destructively, black political organizations including the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panther Party. The program was not a passive surveillance operation. Its documented activities included infiltrating organizations with informants who disrupted their internal functioning, sending anonymous letters designed to create conflict between leaders and organizations, fabricating evidence to discredit leaders, coordinating with local law enforcement to conduct arrests on pretextual charges, and, in the case of the Black Panther Party's Fred Hampton, facilitating the circumstances of his assassination by Chicago police in December 1969. Hampton was assassinated in his sleep during a raid on his apartment. He was 21 years old. The program was exposed in 1971 when activists broke into the FBI's Media, Pennsylvania office and stole files that were subsequently distributed to journalists. The stolen documents revealed the existence and methods of COINTELPRO. Subsequent congressional investigations confirmed the scope of the program. The FBI officially terminated COINTELPRO in 1971 following the exposure. The Church Committee investigated the program and recommended reforms. The specific practices of COINTELPRO, infiltration, disruption, neutralization of political leadership, are subject to legal restrictions imposed after the investigations. Whether those restrictions have been maintained, and whether analogous programs have operated under different names and classifications, is a question the available public record does not definitively answer. The history is sufficient to establish that the FBI conducted what amounted to a covert war against the civil rights movement. The past is not the past. Story 28. Corporate Conspiracy as Business Model. The List That Never Ends. The category of things that were called conspiracy theories and then turned out to be true is substantially occupied by corporate malfeasance that was denied, litigated, and eventually confirmed in court records, congressional testimony, and internal documents released through discovery or whistleblowing. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute a predictable feature of corporate behavior in industries with significant liability exposure. The tobacco industry is the foundational case. Internal documents released through litigation in the 1990s established that the major tobacco companies had known since the 1950s that cigarette smoking caused cancer, had conducted internal research confirming the relationship, and had systematically suppressed, contradicted, and discredited the external scientific consensus while publicly denying the causal relationship. The denial was not passive incomprehension, but an active, coordinated strategy involving the creation of industry-funded research organizations, the recruitment of scientists willing to produce contrary conclusions, and the influencing of regulatory and legislative processes to prevent or delay regulation. The pharmaceutical opioid crisis follows the same template. Internal Purdue Pharma documents revealed through litigation established that the company knew OxyContin's addiction potential was significantly higher than publicly claimed, that sales representatives were trained to minimize the addiction risk in conversations with physicians, and that the company's marketing strategy specifically targeted physicians in communities with high rates of chronic pain and limited access to addiction treatment. The marketing produced an epidemic. The company paid fines. No executive served prison time. Leaded gasoline, which the oil and automotive industries promoted as a fuel additive for decades while suppressing research on its neurological effects. D, whose manufacturers contested the evidence that had been available to them since the 1940s. Foss Chemicals, whose health effects were known internally at 3M and DuPont before they were publicly disclosed. The conspiracy is not a theory. It is an industry standard practice that is documented each time it runs out of road. Story 29. UFOs were secret aircraft. The truth that was more useful than the lie. The U.S. Air Force's official UFO investigation program, Project Blue Book, which operated from 1952 to 1969, closed with the conclusion that the vast majority of UFO reports had conventional explanations, and that the remainder did not represent a threat to national security or evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. The program was publicly presented as a thorough scientific investigation that had settled the question of unidentified aerial phenomena. The classified dimension of the UFO question, revealed through subsequent declassification, was that a significant fraction of the high-quality UFO reports, the ones from trained military observers, the ones with radar confirmation, the ones that proved most difficult to explain, were sightings of classified U.S. aircraft. The U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, operational from the mid-1950s, flew at altitudes of 70,000 feet that were far beyond the service ceiling of any aircraft known to the public. Civilian pilots and observers who sighted the U-2 at altitude, seeing a bright metallic object moving at unusual speed and altitude, reported it as a UFO. The Air Force knew what it was and could not say. The CIA history of the U-2 program, declassified in 1998, states explicitly that many of the UFO reports generated during the program's operational period were U-2 sightings. The policy of allowing the UFO interpretation to stand rather than revealing the classified aircraft served the security interest. The public's readiness to believe in alien aircraft was operationally useful as cover for classified aviation programs. The more recent pattern of UAP disclosure, in which the U.S. government has acknowledged the existence of genuinely unexplained aerial phenomena, while simultaneously revealing the existence of classified programs that were previously denied, is consistent with the historical pattern. Some of what was called UFOs were classified aircraft. The remainder of the explanation is still classified. Story 30. Biological and radiation experiments on American citizens, the known program. The United States government conducted documented programs of biological, chemical, and radiological experimentation on its own citizens without their knowledge or consent across several decades of the 20th century. This is not disputed. The programs are documented in congressional records, declassified government documents, and the findings of multiple presidential commissions and congressional investigations. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established by President Clinton in 1994, documented thousands of experiments conducted between 1944 and 1974, in which American citizens were exposed to ionizing radiation without their knowledge or meaningful informed consent. Patients at hospitals affiliated with government research programs were injected with plutonium, uranium, and other radioactive materials. Prisoners at state penitentiaries were subjected to testicular irradiation. Mentally disabled residents of state schools were fed radioactive oatmeal. Military personnel were exposed to radiation at nuclear test sites without adequate protection or informed consent. The biological experimentation programs included the open-air release of biological agents over populated areas, as previously discussed, and the Tuskegee study. They also included Project Artichoke and McCultra, which tested the effects of LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, and other psychoactive substances on individuals who had not consented to their administration. The standard government response to these programs, when they became public, has been threefold: acknowledgement that they occurred, characterization of them as historical abuses that have been corrected by subsequent regulatory reforms, and resistance to providing compensation to survivors and their families. The reforms introduced following the investigations: the Belmont Report, the Common Rule governing research ethics, the strengthening of institutional review boards, represent genuine changes to the regulatory environment for human subjects research. Whether they represent adequate deterrence against classified research programs that operate outside the civilian regulatory framework is a question the classification system prevents from being answered publicly. Story 31. Gulf of Tonkin and the Lusitania, the false flags that started the wars. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 was presented to Congress and the American public as an unprovoked North Vietnamese attack on U.S. Navy vessels in international waters. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress 3 days after the reported second attack, authorized the president to use military force in Southeast Asia and provided the legal basis for the escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. By the time the war ended, approximately 58,000 American military personnel and an estimated 2 to 3.5 million Vietnamese had died. The first Gulf of Tonkin attack, on August 2, 1964, was a genuine engagement, though in contested circumstances. The second attack, on August 4, 1964, almost certainly did not occur. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara subsequently acknowledged that the evidence for the second attack was contradictory at the time, and that he was not certain it had occurred. The NSA released declassified documents in 2005, showing that its analysts had manipulated the intelligence reports about the August 4 incident to support the conclusion that an attack had occurred. The second attack that provided the political justification for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was fabricated. The Erms Lusitania, sunk by a German U-boat in May 1915 with the loss of 198 lives, including 128 Americans, has long been a subject of debate about whether the British and American governments had advanced knowledge of the attack and allowed it to proceed. Documents released over subsequent decades confirm that British intelligence was aware of U-boat activity on the Lusitania's route, and that the ship was not given a naval escort. Whether this constitutes deliberate non-prevention, allowing the ship to be sunk to generate American public support for British belligerence, or intelligence failure, is a question the documents suggest, but do not conclusively answer. Both cases follow the pattern: a dramatic incident, imperfect at the edges, that provided political justification for military action that the administration had already decided to take. Story 32. Bohemian Grove. The 2-week summer camp for the most powerful men in the world. The Bohemian Grove is a private campground in Monte Rio, California, belonging to the Bohemian Club, a private men's club founded in San Francisco in 1872. For approximately 2 weeks every July, the Grove hosts a gathering of approximately 2,000 invited guests that has, since the late 19th century, constituted one of the most exclusive assemblies of the American elite in existence. Attendees historically have included sitting presidents, former presidents, cabinet secretaries, military leaders, intelligence officials, corporate executives, and members of the cultural and academic establishment. Richard Nixon described it as the most faggy goddamned thing you ever saw, which suggests the atmosphere is more informal than the attendee list implies. The event is real and not particularly secret about its existence. The Bohemian Club publishes materials about its history. The attendee list, while not officially published, has been reconstructed through journalism and is reasonably well documented. What happens inside the 2-week gathering is less well documented by design. The event operates under a strict no-recording policy, and attendees are expected to maintain the Grove's tradition of confidentiality about specific conversations. The conspiracy dimension involves both what happens at the Grove and who attends. The annual Cremation of Care ceremony, a theatrical ritual in which a robed procession burns an effigy representing worldly care before a large stone owl, has been interpreted as evidence of occult practice by people who find its imagery alarming. The ceremony was recorded covertly by Alex Jones in 2000. It is, on the recording, a theatrical event that resembles a fraternal ceremony more than an occult ritual, though the line between those categories is not always clear. What happens at a 2-week gathering of 2,000 of the most powerful people in the United States, in a setting specifically designed to facilitate informal conversation outside of official channels, is the kind of question that the conspiracy concerns are actually pointing at. Whether it is occult worship or networking depends on your priorities. Story 33. McCarthy was right. The infiltration he found and the method that discredited the finding Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist investigations of the early 1950s destroyed careers, polarized the country, and established McCarthyism as a term for reckless accusation and the abuse of political power for personal advantage. McCarthy made accusations he could not support, destroyed people on the basis of association and rumor, and conducted his investigations with a combination of genuine malice and political opportunism that delegitimized the entire enterprise of investigating communist influence in the American government. He was censured by the Senate in 1954 and died in 1957, politically destroyed. The uncomfortable historical footnote is that Soviet infiltration of the U.S. government was real. The Venona Project, a classified NSA program that decrypted Soviet intelligence communications from the 1940s, partially declassified in the 1990s, revealed that the Soviet Union had successfully placed agents in the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, and other federal agencies. Among the individuals identified through Venona decrypts as having passed information to Soviet intelligence were Alger Hiss, a senior State Department official, and Harry Dexter White, a senior Treasury official. The historians who have studied Venona have reached different conclusions about the extent of Soviet influence and the degree to which it affected policy. What is not disputed is that Soviet intelligence had active agents in positions of some significance in the U.S. government during the period McCarthy was investigating. McCarthy's methods were so destructive, producing a climate in which accusation itself was sufficient for career destruction, in which the targets had no meaningful procedural protections, that the genuine security problem he was nominally investigating became impossible to address through his methods. The real problem existed. The method used to find it made it worse. Story 34. MLK's assassination, the government involvement the court found credible. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4, 1968, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. James Earl Ray pleaded guilty to the murder in 1969, serving 99 years in a Tennessee prison. He subsequently recanted his guilty plea and maintained his innocence until his death in 1998. The official account holds that Ray acted alone. In 1999, the King family brought a wrongful death civil suit against Lloyd Jowers, a Memphis restaurant owner who claimed to have been part of a conspiracy to end King involving the FBI, the Memphis Police Department, and organized crime. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour before finding Jowers liable and concluding that a conspiracy had existed involving government agencies. The Department of Justice conducted its own investigation and concluded the jury's finding was not sufficient to overturn the official account. The Justice Department review is not regarded as a neutral assessment by King family members, who considered it another layer of cover-up. The FBI's documented hostility toward King is the background against which these claims are assessed. COINTELPRO documents revealed that the FBI had conducted an extensive surveillance and harassment campaign against King for years before his assassination. J. Edgar Hoover described King as the most dangerous Negro in America. The FBI sent King an anonymous letter encouraging him to commit suicide. The agency recorded his private conversations and threatened to release the recordings publicly. Whether the FBI's documented intention to neutralize King as a political figure extended to participation in his assassination is the question that the civil jury's finding addresses, but does not conclusively settle. James Earl Ray had connections that have not been fully explained. The rifle found at the scene had fingerprints wiped. The full documentary record has not been released. A conspiracy involving some government actors remains a plausible account of what the evidence describes. Story 35. Giant squid, the conspiracy of the sea that is actually just a very large squid. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, was, for most of recorded history, a creature known only from partial remains. Tentacles found in the stomachs of sperm whales, arms washed up on beaches, fragmentary specimens in various states of decomposition. The creature's existence was not seriously doubted by scientists. The evidence was too consistent and too widespread. But its behavior, biology, and habitat were almost entirely unknown. It occupied the same cultural space as the Kraken of Norse mythology: real, large, deep, and inaccessible. The first photograph of a live giant squid in its natural habitat was taken in 2004. A team of Japanese researchers led by Tsunemi Kubodera deployed a camera at approximately 900 meters depth in the North Pacific and obtained 556 photographs of a live Architeuthis over a 4-hour period, before the animal detached a tentacle attempting to free itself from the baited hook and descended back into the deep. The first video footage of a live giant squid was captured in 2012 in the Pacific Ocean near the Ogasawara Islands at a depth of approximately 630 meters. The giant squid reached lengths of up to 13 meters and has eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any animal on Earth, adapted for seeing in the minimal light of the deep ocean. It is a predator of fish and other squid, and is itself prey for sperm whales, whose skin frequently bears the sucker scars of giant squid encounters. The squid's intelligence, social behavior, and lifespan are almost entirely unknown. It is an enormous animal that lives in the largest habitat on Earth, about which we know almost nothing. The conspiracy is that we share a planet with a bus-sized predator that has been photographed alive for less than 20 years, and the general public considers this less interesting than most of the other items on this list. The giant squid is real. It is very large. It doesn't care about any of this.